Hello, my dearest history slumberers, and welcome back to the warm, comforting embrace of historical inevitability. Tonight, we are setting our rather rickety but comfortable time-traveling vessel toward the sun-drenched, perpetually complicated lands of the Iberian Peninsula. We are going to drift through the long, winding, and often baffling story of Spain, a country that seems to have experienced every possible historical trend, usually all at once, and often with a shrug and a muttered, "Well, what can you do?" It's a history that feels less like a linear progression and more like a series of passionate, contradictory, and deeply confusing family arguments played out over several millennia. Before we dive into the delightful chaos of competing kingdoms and questionable royal decisions, let me first extend a truly profound, slightly sleepy thank you to the magnificent souls who make this rambling historical narration possible. To the ever-vigilant sound sorceress, Esmeralda of the Echoes, may your audio landscapes always be lush and your silences perfectly timed to allow for maximum dramatic sighing. To Sir Reginald Worthington III, a name so grand it surely comes with its own coat of arms, a small, well-behaved dog, and a hereditary distrust of anything new. To the trio of intellectual titans, Penelope Clearwater, Barnaby Finch, and Alastair Cromwell, whose names sound like a particularly sharp-witted detective agency from a black-and-white film, specializing in the case of the missing semicolon. And of course, to the enigmatic Starlight Rider, thank you for your cosmic commitment to the study of ancient tax codes and agricultural reforms. You are the sturdy, reliable foundation upon which this empire of relaxation is built. Now, let us turn our weary, yet curious, minds to the very land itself. Spain. It's not so much a country as it is a continent in miniature, a geological drama playing out in slow motion. It's a place where the mountains decided to get serious. The Pyrenees in the north don't just separate Spain from France. They form a formidable, almost theatrical barrier, a great wall of rock that for centuries told the rest of Europe, "Don't even think about it, we're busy." This isn't just a border, it's a statement of intent, a geological declaration of splendid isolation. Then there's the Meseta Central, a vast, high plateau that dominates the country's interior. It's a place of harsh extremes, scorching in the summer and freezing in the winter, a landscape that breeds a certain stoic, unyielding character in its people. It's the kind of place that makes you understand why someone might invent the siesta. It's not laziness, it's a survival strategy, a deeply rational response to a sun that seems personally offended by the very concept of outdoor activity between the hours of 2 and 5 in the afternoon. This is a land of dramatic environmental mood swings. You have the lush, green, perpetually damp coasts of the north, the green Spain, where the weather can't seem to make up its mind, and the landscape looks more like Ireland than the stereotypical image of sun-baked plains. Here, the historical struggle wasn't against invaders, but against the creeping damp and the existential gloom of a sky that can't decide what shade of gray it wants to be. Then you have the arid, almost desert-like regions of the south and east, where the sun beats down with the relentless enthusiasm of a tax collector. The famous line from My Fair Lady, "The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain," is a delightful piece of fiction, a meteorological fantasy. The rain in Spain, as any Spaniard will tell you with a world-weary sigh, is a marvel, a miracle, a rare and celebrated event, especially in Seville. The Spanish translation, La Lluvia and Sevilla es una maravilla captures the sentiment perfectly. Rain isn't a nuisance, it's a blessing, an excuse for a party, a front-page news story. This geographical diversity isn't just a fun fact for a travel brochure, it's the central tension of Spanish history. For centuries, this rugged topography meant that Spain was less a unified kingdom and more a collection of isolated neighborhoods, each with its own climate, its own culture, its own dialect, and its own profound suspicion of the people over the next mountain range. Before the advent of high-speed trains and motorways, those modern miracles that flatten space and compress time, traveling across Spain was an ordeal. It was a journey of winding mountain passes, treacherous river crossings, and the constant, nagging feeling that you were probably lost. This division, this inherent regionalism, is a ghost that haunts Spanish politics to this very day. It's a history shaped not just by kings and conquerors, but by the very mountains and rivers that carved the land into a complex, beautiful, and eternally quarrelsome mosaic. It's a country that was practically designed by nature to be difficult to govern, a fact that would cause centuries of headaches for a long line of ambitious but ultimately frustrated rulers. And now, let us drift even further back, before the Romans brought their roads and their regulations, before the Carthaginians came looking for silver, before anyone had even thought of writing things down. Let's go back to a time when the most pressing political issue was figuring out how to paint a bison on a cave wall. The earliest residents of this land, the Neanderthals, were eventually joined and replaced by our own direct ancestors, the Cro-Magnon people. These were the original Spaniards, and they were artists. The cave paintings they left behind are not just crude doodles. They are masterpieces of prehistoric art, vibrant and full of life. Imagine, if you will, a small group of these early humans huddled deep within the earth in a place like the caves of Altamira. By the flickering light of an animal fat lamp, they use natural pigments, ochre, charcoal, manganese, to bring the world outside into the darkness of the cave. They paint the great beasts that dominate their lives, the powerful bison, the charging wild boar, the graceful deer. These weren't just decorations. They were likely part of complex rituals, attempts to capture the spirit of the animals to ensure a successful hunt, or perhaps simply to tell the stories of their lives. In the Cueva de la Vieja, we see stick-figure men hunting stags with spears, a scene of dynamic action frozen for millennia. In the Cueva de la Pailita, there's a veritable menagerie, including a huge, mysterious fish. This is the first chapter of Spanish history, written not in words, but in pictures on the cold, silent stone. It's a history that begins not with kings, but with artists. Then, as the last ice age receded, the climate warmed and the world changed. The great, lumbering mammals that had been the stars of the cave paintings began to disappear, hunted to extinction or unable to adapt to the new environment. Humans, ever adaptable, turned to new strategies. They began to domesticate plants and animals, giving rise to agriculture and herding. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle slowly gave way to more settled communities. In places like the Cueva de Lor, permanent villages emerged, places where people lived year-round. With settlement came new developments, specialized crafts, trade networks, and the need for more complex social structures. You can't have a village without having meetings, and you can't have meetings without having arguments. The long and storied history of Spanish bureaucracy had begun, probably with a heated debate over who was responsible for taking out the communal trash. This brings us to the Copper Age, a time when southern Spain became a major center for metallurgy. The ability to work metal was a technological revolution, and it brought with it wealth and social stratification. We see this in the elaborate tombs of the period, filled with rich grave goods that speak of powerful chieftains and a society that was becoming increasingly complex. The archaeological site of Los Milars in Almeria is a stunning example of this era. It was a fortified town, complete with defensive walls, a necropolis of grand, beehive-shaped tombs, and evidence of a thriving community. It was a city, a proto-civilization, a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of these early Iberians. They were building a world, one copper axe and one stone wall at a time. And as we shall see, the desire to build bigger walls and acquire more metal would become a recurring theme in the grand, sleepy drama of Spanish history. But for now, let us rest here, in the quiet dawn of civilization, before the great empires arrive to make things complicated right after this brief, soothing pause. Welcome back, gentle listeners, to the soothing, yet surprisingly dramatic, annals of Spanish history. We left our ancient Iberians on the cusp of civilization, happily smelting copper and building fortified towns, blissfully unaware that their peninsula was about to become the most popular and most fought-over piece of real estate in the ancient world. Because when you have a land rich in silver, tin, and other shiny things, it's only a matter of time before the great powers of the day show up, uninvited, like distant relatives who heard you won the lottery. First came the Phoenicians, those intrepid sailors and master traders from the eastern Mediterranean. They arrived around 1100 BC, not as conquerors, but as businessmen. They founded the city of Gator, modern-day Cadiz, which has a strong claim to being the oldest continuously inhabited city in Western Europe. The Phoenicians were followed by the Greeks, who set up their own trading posts along the coast. This was the beginning of Spain's long and complicated relationship with the outside world. The locals, a mix of Iberians in the south and east and Celts in the north and west, were introduced to new technologies, new ideas, and most importantly, the concept of writing. History, in the written sense, had arrived in Spain, but the real trouble started with Carthage. The Carthaginians, originally Phoenician colonists themselves, had built a mighty empire based in modern-day Tunisia. After getting thoroughly beaten by the Romans in the First Punic War, they looked to Spain as a new base of operations, a place to rebuild their strength and, more importantly, to find the silver needed to pay their war debts. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca arrived in Spain with the grim determination of a man who has just had a very bad meeting with his bank manager. He and his successors, including his famously elephant-loving son Hannibal, didn't just set up trading posts. They began a systematic conquest of the peninsula. This, of course, did not go unnoticed by Rome. The Romans, having just defeated Carthage, were in no mood to see their rivals build a new empire on their doorstep. The two powers, with the cheerful belligerence of two alpha dogs in a very small park, drew a line in the sand, or rather, a line at the Ebro River. They signed a treaty agreeing that Carthage would not expand north of the Ebro. Hannibal, in a move that would define his career, looked at the treaty, looked at the Roman-allied city of Saguntum, which was south of the Ebro, but that was just a minor detail, and decided to sack it anyway. The Second Punic War was on, and Spain was now its main stage. What followed was a brutal, 17-year-long struggle for control of the peninsula. It was a war of brilliant tactics, grueling sieges, and staggering logistical challenges. The Romans, led by the brilliant General Scipio Africanus, eventually managed to push the Carthaginians out of Spain entirely by 206 BC. They had come to Spain to counter a threat, but now that they were there, they looked around at the rich mines and fertile lands and decided, with the casual acquisitiveness of a true superpower, to stay. The conquest of Spain, however, was to be their longest and most frustrating military adventure. It took the Romans nearly 200 years to fully subdue the peninsula. 2 centuries. They conquered Gaul in 8 years. They absorbed Greece with barely a fight. But Spain was different. The problem was the locals. The Celtiberian tribes of the interior were not particularly impressed by the majesty of Rome. They were fierce, independent warriors who knew their mountainous terrain and were not about to start paying taxes to some distant city just because they had better-looking shields. The Romans found themselves bogged down in a series of brutal, grinding guerrilla wars. The names of the Lusitanian chief Viriathus and the city of Numantia became legendary in Rome, symbols of the fierce, almost suicidal resistance of the Spanish tribes. Viriathus, a brilliant guerrilla leader, ran circles around Roman legions for years, a constant thorn in the side of the Republic. The siege of Numantia was even more dramatic. The city held out against a massive Roman army for months, its inhabitants choosing mass suicide over surrender. The Romans had won, but the victory was a grim one. It was a clear message. Conquering Spain would be a bloody, thankless, and incredibly expensive business. Eventually, of course, Rome's relentless military machine prevailed. By the time of Emperor Augustus, around 19 BC, the conquest was finally complete. The peninsula was divided into provinces, roads were built, cities were founded, and the process of Romanization began in earnest. And what a process it was! Spain became one of the most important and prosperous parts of the Roman Empire. It produced not just silver, wine, and olive oil, but also emperors. Trajan, Hadrian, and Theodosius I were all of Spanish origin. It gave the world great writers like Seneca and Lucan. The Spanish language itself is a direct descendant of the Vulgar Latin spoken by Roman soldiers and colonists. For 400 years, Hispania, as the Romans called it, was a cornerstone of the Roman world, a place of peace, prosperity, and beautifully engineered aqueducts. But as we all know, empires, no matter how mighty, don't last forever. By the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire was in a state of terminal decline, suffering from what we might call a severe case of imperial overstretch and a rather nasty series of barbarian invasions. The intricate system of administration, trade, and defense that had held the empire together for so long began to crumble. And in the winter of 406 AD, a large group of Germanic tribes, the Vandals, the Suebi, and the Alans, crossed the frozen Rhine River and poured into Gaul. A few years later, in 409, they crossed the Pyrenees and entered Spain. The Roman party was officially over. What followed was a period of chaos and confusion, a messy free-for-all as these various groups carved out kingdoms for themselves from the corpse of Roman Hispania. But another Germanic group was on its way: the Visigoths. The Visigoths had a rather complicated relationship with the Romans. Sometimes they were enemies, sometimes they were allies. In this case, they entered Spain initially as allies of Rome, tasked with dealing with the other Germanic invaders. They dealt with them so effectively that they decided to take over the place for themselves. By the late 5th century, the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania was established, with its capital first in Toulouse, in modern France, and later in Toledo, in the heart of Spain. The Visigoths were a warrior aristocracy, a minority ruling over a much larger Hispano-Roman population. For a long time, the two groups lived side by side, separated by law and, most importantly, by religion. The Visigoths were Arian Christians, a branch of Christianity that had been declared heretical by the mainstream Catholic Church, to which the Hispano-Roman population belonged. This created a fundamental division in the kingdom. It was as if the management and the workforce of a large corporation belonged to rival, mutually suspicious religions. It was not a recipe for long-term stability. Eventually, in 587, King Reccared I, in a move of brilliant political pragmatism, converted to Catholicism. This was a pivotal moment. It removed the main barrier between the Visigoths and their subjects, paving the way for the fusion of the two cultures into a single, unified people. The Visigothic kingdom seemed to be on the right track. They unified the peninsula politically, drove out the last remnants of Byzantine power from the coast, and created a common legal code. They saw themselves as the proud successors of Rome, the guardians of civilization in a troubled age. They built beautiful churches, produced intricate metalwork, and fostered a vibrant intellectual life, most famously represented by Isidore of Seville, a scholar who tried to summarize all human knowledge in a single, massive encyclopedia. It was an ambitious, if slightly mad, undertaking, a perfect symbol of the Visigothic era. But the Visigothic kingdom had a fatal flaw. Its politics were a disaster. The monarchy was elective, not hereditary. In theory, this might sound wonderfully democratic. In practice, it was a recipe for chronic instability, a perpetual, bloody reality show in which rival noble factions were constantly plotting, assassinating, and launching civil wars to place their candidate on the throne. Almost every succession was accompanied by a crisis. It was a political system seemingly designed by someone who really hated stability, and it was one of these succession crises that would bring the whole edifice crashing down. In the year 710, King Witiza died, and a noble named Roderick seized the throne, bypassing Witiza's sons. The supporters of Witiza's sons, in a move of spectacular short-sightedness, decided to seek help from outside. They looked across the narrow strait of water at the southern tip of Spain to North Africa, where a new and dynamic power had recently arrived, the armies of the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. They asked the Muslim governor of North Africa, Tariq ibn Ziyad, for a small force to help them in their civil war. In 711, Tariq crossed the strait with a small army of Berbers, landing at the great rock that would henceforth bear his name, Jabal Tariq, or Tariq's Mountain, Gibraltar. His intention was likely just to raid and perhaps tip the scales in the Visigothic civil war. But what he found was a kingdom rotten to the core, divided and weakened by its endless internal squabbles. At the Battle of Guadalete, Tariq's small force met King Roderick's army. The details are murky, but it seems that part of Roderick's army, loyal to the sons of Witiza, deserted in the middle of the battle. Roderick was defeated and killed. The Visigothic kingdom collapsed like a house of cards. Tariq and his commander, Musa ibn Nusair, who soon followed with a larger army, must have been astonished. They had come for a raid and found a kingdom ripe for the taking. In a few short years, Muslim armies swept through the peninsula, meeting surprisingly little resistance. City after city opened its gates. By 718, almost the entire peninsula was under Muslim control. Only a few small pockets of resistance held out in the remote northern mountains. A new chapter in Spanish history had begun, one that would see the creation of one of the most brilliant and sophisticated civilizations of the Middle Ages. The Visigothic dream was over, and the land the Romans had called Hispania would now be known as Al-Andalus. And there, in the mountains of the north, a few beleaguered Visigothic nobles were nursing their wounds and planning their revenge, a revenge that would take nearly 800 years to complete. But that, my dear slumberers, is a story for after this brief, soothing paused. Welcome back, my drowsy disciples of the past. We return to the Iberian Peninsula, a land that has just undergone a political and cultural earthquake of seismic proportions. The once proud Visigothic kingdom, with its grand Roman pretensions and its spectacularly dysfunctional politics, has vanished almost overnight, swept away by the whirlwind of the Arab conquest. In its place, a new entity has emerged, Al-Andalus. For the next 7.5 centuries, the history of Spain will be the history of a land divided, a frontier zone between two worlds, Christian Europe to the north and the Islamic Dar al-Islam to the south. It will be a story of conflict, certainly, but also of coexistence, of cultural fusion, and of a brilliance that would illuminate the darkest corners of medieval Europe. The new rulers of Al-Andalus were a diverse group. The initial conquerors were a mix of Arabs, who formed the new elite, and a majority of North African Berbers, who made up the bulk of the armies. They established their rule over a population that was mostly Hispano-Roman and Visigothic Christians, along with a significant and long-established Jewish community. The new Islamic administration, part of the vast Umayyad Caliphate that stretched from the borders of India to the Atlantic, was, in the beginning, surprisingly pragmatic. They were not interested in forced conversions. This wasn't an act of pure, enlightened tolerance, you understand. It was just good business. Christians and Jews, as people of the book, were granted protected status as dhimmi. They were allowed to practice their religion and govern their own internal affairs in exchange for paying a special tax, the jizya. For the average farmer, who had been toiling under a Visigothic lord, the change in management was likely not all that dramatic. The new landlord spoke a different language and prayed in a different building, but the rent was still due on Friday. Many Christians, known as Mozarabs, adopted Arabic language and customs without giving up their faith, creating a vibrant, hybrid culture. Many others, over time, did convert to Islam, becoming known as muwallads. Meanwhile, in the rugged, rainy mountains of the far north, the story was very different. Here, in the tiny kingdom of Asturias, a small group of Visigothic nobles and local leaders had managed to hold out against the Islamic tide. Their leader was a man named Pelayo, a figure shrouded in legend. Around the year 722, at a place called Covadonga, Pelayo's small band of warriors ambushed and defeated a Muslim force. From a purely military perspective, it was probably a minor skirmish, a border incident. But in the grand narrative of Spanish history, it was everything. This was the moment that the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain, was born. It was a tiny spark of defiance that would, over the next 770 years, grow into a raging fire. The Asturian kings, styling themselves as the heirs of the Visigoths, began the slow, arduous process of pushing their borders south, one valley, one castle at a time. It was a deeply religious struggle, a crusade before the Crusades were even a thing, but it was also a land grab, a centuries-long real estate venture with God's apparent endorsement. Back in Al-Andalus, things were getting interesting. In the year 750, far away in Damascus, the Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown by a new dynasty, the Abbasids. The Abbasids, in the time-honored tradition of dynastic takeovers, proceeded to hunt down and execute every member of the Umayyad family they could find. But one young prince, Abd al-Rahman, escaped. After a harrowing, 5-year journey across North Africa, a journey worthy of its own epic film, he arrived in Spain in 755. He was a man with no army and no money, but he had the one thing that mattered, the Umayyad name. He rallied the factions in Al-Andalus who were still loyal to his family, defeated the governor appointed by the Abbasids, and declared himself the independent emir of Córdoba. It was a stunning achievement. Abd al-Rahman had not only survived, but he had carved out his own kingdom from the ruins of his family's empire. He was the ultimate survivor, the CEO who, after being fired in a hostile takeover, starts a new, even more successful company across the street. Under Abd al-Rahman and his successors, Al-Andalus was transformed. They established a centralized state, built a powerful army, and turned their capital, Córdoba, into the most magnificent city in Europe. By the 10th century, while Paris and London were little more than muddy, provincial towns, Córdoba was a sprawling metropolis of 500,000 people. It had paved streets, street lighting, hundreds of mosques, public baths, libraries, and hospitals. It was a center of learning and culture that drew scholars from all over the Islamic world and even from Christian Europe. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, with its forest of candy-striped arches, was an architectural marvel, a building that seemed to defy gravity and logic in its serene, hypnotic beauty. This was the golden age of Al-Andalus, particularly under the reign of Abd al-Rahman III, who in 929 took the ultimate step and declared himself caliph, the supreme leader of the faithful, in direct challenge to the Abbasids in Baghdad and the Fatimids in North Africa. The Caliphate of Córdoba was the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Its scholars made groundbreaking advances in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. They translated the works of the ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, which had been largely forgotten in the Christian West. It was through the Arabic translations and commentaries produced in Toledo and Córdoba that much of this classical knowledge would eventually be reintroduced to Europe, sparking the intellectual ferment of the High Middle Ages. Al-Andalus was not just a political entity, it was a bridge, a conduit through which the wisdom of the ancient world flowed back into the consciousness of Europe. But this golden age, like all golden ages, could not last. The Caliphate of Córdoba, for all its brilliance, suffered from the same political disease that had afflicted the Visigoths: internal division. After the death of the powerful ruler Al-Mansur in 1002, the Caliphate descended into a ruinous civil war. By 1031, it had shattered completely. In its place arose a patchwork of smaller, independent principalities known as the Taifa kingdoms. There were taifas in Seville, Granada, Toledo, Zaragoza, Valencia, each with its own petty king, its own court, and its own intense rivalry with all its neighbors. For the small Christian kingdoms in the north, now including Leon, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, this was a golden opportunity. The unified, powerful caliphate had been an intimidating foe. The squabbling Taifa kingdoms were easy prey. The Christian kings perfected a lucrative business model: the parias. They would offer a Taifa king protection from his Christian and Muslim rivals in exchange for a hefty annual tribute in gold. It was essentially a medieval protection racket. The Christian kingdoms grew rich and strong on the gold of Al-Andalus, which they then used to fund their armies to conquer the very Taifas that were paying them. It was a brilliantly cynical strategy. The most famous figure of this era is Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid. The legendary national hero of Spain, El Cid was, in reality, a far more complex and interesting figure. He was a Castilian nobleman and a brilliant general who, after a falling out with his own king, became a mercenary captain. He fought for whoever would pay him, sometimes for Christian kings, sometimes for Muslim Taifa rulers. He even carved out his own personal kingdom in Valencia and ruled it as his own private fiefdom. El Cid was the ultimate pragmatist, a man who navigated the treacherous, shifting alliances of the Taifa period with ruthless skill. He was a symbol of his age, a time when faith was important, but gold and power were often more so. The Reconquista was now gathering serious momentum. In 1085, King Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon captured the great city of Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital. This was a huge strategic and symbolic victory. The Christian frontier had just taken a giant leap southward, right into the heart of the peninsula. The fall of Toledo sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. The remaining Taifa kings, terrified that they would be next, made a fateful decision. They appealed for help from a new, formidable power in North Africa, the Almoravids. The Almoravids were a dynasty of zealous, fundamentalist Berber warriors. They had forged a vast empire in North Africa, and their leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, was a man of stern, ascetic piety. He crossed into Spain with a powerful army and, at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086, inflicted a crushing defeat on Alfonso VI. The Reconquista was brought to a screeching halt. But the Taifa kings soon discovered they had made a terrible mistake. The Almoravids, disgusted by what they saw as the decadence and religious laxity of the Taifa courts, decided not just to help them, but to annex them. One by one, the Taifa kingdoms were swallowed up, and Al-Andalus was once again unified under a single, powerful, and deeply conservative regime. The Almoravids were then followed by another, even more zealous Berber dynasty, the Almohads, in the mid-12th century. For a century and a half, the Christian kingdoms faced a unified and powerful Al-Andalus, backed by the resources of a North African empire. The frontier hardened, and the struggle became more intense, more ideological. But the Christian kingdoms were also growing stronger, more unified. The decisive turning point came in 1212. At the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, a combined army of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, with crusaders from all over Europe, won a shattering victory over the Almohad Caliph. The back of Almohad power in Spain was broken. The aftermath was swift. In the following decades, the Christian kingdoms swept south. Córdoba, the jewel of Al-Andalus, fell in 1236. Seville, its largest city, fell in 1248. By the middle of the 13th century, the Reconquista was all but complete. Of the once vast territory of Al-Andalus, only one small corner remained in Muslim hands, the Emirate of Granada in the far south, nestled against the Sierra Nevada mountains. For the next 2.5 centuries, Granada would survive as a vassal state of Castile, paying tribute to its Christian overlords, a final, beautiful, and melancholy echo of a lost world. It was a kingdom living on borrowed time, a magnificent museum piece, home to the breathtaking palace of the Alhambra. And all the while, the Christian kingdoms of Spain were consolidating their power, growing into the entities that would, in a few short centuries, unite to form a single kingdom and then explode onto the world stage, changing the course of history forever. But that, my sleepy friends, is a tale for another time after this brief and well-deserved pause. Hello again, my dedicated students of the somnolent past. Welcome back. We left Spain in a curious state of suspended animation. The great, dramatic surge of the Reconquista was over, leaving the once mighty Al-Andalus reduced to a single, glittering jewel, the Emirate of Granada. For 2.5 centuries, this last remnant of Muslim Spain survived, a political anomaly paying tribute to the powerful Christian kingdom of Castile. Meanwhile, the rest of the peninsula was dominated by a handful of Christian kingdoms, primarily Castile, Aragon, Portugal, and Navarre. The stage was set for the final act of the medieval drama and the birth of modern Spain. The late Middle Ages in Spain were a time of consolidation, conflict, and chaos. The Christian kingdoms, having vanquished their common foe, now had more time and energy to devote to their favorite pastime, fighting each other. Castile, the largest and most powerful of the kingdoms, was particularly prone to bouts of spectacular political instability. It was a kingdom blessed with vast territory, but cursed with an overmighty nobility and a series of succession crises that make the Visigothic era look like a model of good governance. The kings of Castile were constantly struggling to assert their authority over powerful noble families who behaved less like loyal subjects and more like independent warlords, ruling their vast estates as private kingdoms. To the east, the crown of Aragon was a very different beast. It wasn't a centralized kingdom like Castile, but a composite monarchy, a federation of territories, including Aragon, Catalonia, and Valencia, each with its own laws, its own parliament, courts, and its own fiercely guarded traditions. The King of Aragon had to negotiate his policies with these different bodies, making for a much more contractual and less autocratic style of rule. While Castile was focused inward on the Reconquista and its own internal squabbles, Aragon looked outward, toward the Mediterranean. The Catalans, in particular, were master sailors and merchants, and they built a maritime empire that stretched to Sicily, Sardinia, Naples, and even, for a time, to Athens. Aragon was a thalassocracy, a sea-based power, a medieval precursor to the great European colonial empires, and then, in the latter half of the 15th century, came the marriage that would change everything. In 1469, Isabella, the heir to the throne of Castile, married Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Aragon. It was a political masterstroke, a union of the peninsula's two largest powers. Their joint reign, which began in earnest in 1479, marked the de facto unification of Spain. They are known to history as the Catholic monarchs, a title bestowed upon them by the Pope, and they were a formidable team. Isabella was pious, strong-willed, and determined to bring order to her chaotic kingdom of Castile. Ferdinand was a shrewd, pragmatic, and often ruthless diplomat, a master of the dark arts of Renaissance statecraft. Together, they set about transforming their separate, medieval kingdoms into a single, modern, and powerful state. Their first order of business was to centralize power. They cracked down on the unruly nobles, reformed the administration, and created a professional army loyal to the crown. They established the Santa Hermandad, or Holy Brotherhood, a kind of national police force that ruthlessly suppressed banditry and restored order to the countryside. They also took control of the powerful military orders, the orders of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, which had become vast, wealthy corporations, states within a state. Ferdinand and Isabella were, in essence, building the machinery of a modern, absolutist monarchy. They were the ultimate power couple, the CEO and COO of the newly formed Corporation of Spain, incorporated with their home front secured. Ferdinand and Isabella turned their attention to the last piece of unfinished business from the Reconquista, the Emirate of Granada. For 10 years, from 1482 to 1492, they waged a relentless, grinding war against the last Muslim stronghold in the peninsula. It was a difficult and expensive undertaking, a war of sieges and scorched earth tactics. But on January 2nd, 1492, the final Nasrid Sultan, Muhammad XII, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, handed over the keys to the city of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella. The last sigh of the Moor in Spain, as the legend goes, was a sigh of sorrow for a lost paradise. The Reconquista was complete. After nearly 8 centuries, the entire Iberian Peninsula, with the exception of Portugal, was under Christian rule. The year 1492 was a pivotal, epoch-making year for Spain, a year of endings and new beginnings. The conquest of Granada was a moment of immense triumph and religious fervor. But it was accompanied by 2 other events that would have equally profound and far-reaching consequences. The first was the Alhambra Decree. In March of 1492, just a few months after the fall of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella issued an edict ordering all Jews in their kingdoms to either convert to Catholicism or leave the country within 4 months. It was a brutal act of religious intolerance, driven by a desire for religious uniformity and, it must be said, by a desire to confiscate the wealth of the departing Jews. Tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews, whose ancestors had lived in Spain for centuries, were forced into exile, taking with them their skills, their knowledge, and their capital. It was a devastating cultural and economic blow to the new kingdom, a self-inflicted wound from which Spain would take centuries to recover. The second event was, of course, a voyage. While the war for Granada was in its final stages, a persistent Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus had been lobbying the monarchs to finance a wildly ambitious, some said insane, project to reach the East Indies by sailing west across the open Atlantic. After several rejections, Isabella, in a flush of post-Granada triumphalism, finally agreed to fund his expedition. It was a speculative venture, a high-risk, high-reward gamble. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus set sail from the port of Palos with 3 small ships. On October 12th, he made landfall on an island in the Bahamas. He was convinced he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He had not. He had stumbled upon a vast, entirely new continent, a new world. The discovery of the Americas would transform Spain from a newly unified European kingdom into the world's first global superpower. The 2 decades that followed Columbus's first voyage were a period of frantic exploration and conquest. Spanish conquistadors, a hardened breed of men forged in the crucible of the Reconquista, fanned out across the Caribbean and then onto the American mainland. They were driven by a potent cocktail of motives: greed for gold, zeal for God, and a thirst for personal glory. In 1519, Hernán Cortés, with a tiny force of a few hundred men, began the audacious conquest of the mighty Aztec Empire in Mexico. A decade later, Francisco Pizarro, with an even smaller band of adventurers, overthrew the vast Inca Empire in Peru. These conquests were astonishingly swift and brutal, made possible by a combination of superior steel weaponry, horses, which were unknown in the Americas and terrified the native populations, and, most devastatingly of all, European diseases. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the native populations had no immunity, swept through the Americas like a biological firestorm, wiping out millions and shattering the social and political structures of the native empires. It was a demographic catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. The result was that Spain, a country that had just spent centuries fighting to reclaim its own territory, suddenly found itself in possession of a vast overseas empire. A flood of gold and, especially, silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru began to pour across the Atlantic into the Spanish treasury. This immense wealth made the Spanish monarchy the richest and most powerful in Europe. It funded Spain's massive armies, its sprawling bureaucracy, and its ambitious foreign policy. For a century and a half, Spain was the dominant power in Europe, the indispensable nation, the hyperpower of its day. But this sudden, almost unimaginable wealth was a poisoned chalice. It created a series of profound and ultimately disastrous economic distortions. The influx of silver caused massive inflation, not just in Spain but across Europe. It discouraged the development of domestic industry and agriculture. Why bother making things when you could just buy them with American silver? The Spanish economy became dangerously dependent on this single source of income, like a modern petrostate. The wealth was used to fight endless wars in Italy, the Netherlands, and Germany, to maintain the global Habsburg Empire, rather than being invested in the long-term economic development of Spain itself. As one contemporary observer noted, the treasure from the Indies was like rain on a roof. It poured down and then ran off, leaving the house as dry as before. It was a paradox that would haunt Spain for centuries. A country that owned the richest mines in the world was perpetually on the verge of bankruptcy, and so, as the 16th century dawned, Spain found itself in a position of unprecedented power and unprecedented challenges. It was the master of a global empire, the defender of the Catholic faith, and the richest nation in Europe. But it was also a country grappling with the immense logistical and moral challenges of ruling a vast and diverse overseas population, an economy dangerously distorted by easy money, and a host of powerful enemies in Europe who were determined to challenge its dominance. The sleepy, inward-looking collection of medieval kingdoms had been catapulted onto the world stage. The siesta was over. Spain's golden age had begun, and with it a whole new set of glorious, complicated, and ultimately exhausting problems. But we shall delve into the splendors and miseries of Habsburg Spain right after this brief, soothing pause. Do drift back, my gentle slumberers, to the grand, gilded, and slightly groaning stage of 16th century Spain. We have arrived at the age of the Habsburgs, a dynasty whose story is a perfect lesson in the perils of spectacular success. Thanks to a series of brilliantly strategic royal marriages, a Habsburg specialty that gave rise to the saying, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." The Spanish crown was inherited by a young man who had won the genetic lottery. His name was Charles, and he was the heir not only to Spain and its burgeoning American empire, but also to the Habsburg lands in Austria, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy. And in 1519, to top it all off, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor, making him the nominal ruler of Germany. One man, ruling a vast, sprawling, and completely unmanageable collection of territories that stretched across Europe and the Americas. It was less an empire and more a logistical nightmare held together by a single, perpetually exhausted man. Charles V, as he became known, was the most powerful man in the world, and also, quite possibly, the most stressed. His reign was a relentless, globe-trotting exercise in crisis management. Imagine being the CEO of a multinational corporation where every single branch is on fire, all at the same time. That was Charles's life. He was constantly shuttling between Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands, trying to hold his vast inheritance together. He fought wars against France, his great rival for dominance in Europe. He fought wars against the Ottoman Empire, the great Islamic superpower that was pushing into the Mediterranean and threatening Vienna. And, most draining of all, he found himself at the epicenter of the greatest religious upheaval in European history, the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther's challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church, which began in 1517, shattered the religious unity of Christendom and, with it, Charles's dream of a universal Catholic empire. As Holy Roman Emperor, Charles saw it as his sacred duty to crush this heresy. But the German princes, many of whom were more interested in seizing church lands and asserting their independence from the emperor than in theological debates, rallied to Luther's cause. Charles spent decades and vast fortunes of Spanish and American silver trying to stamp out Protestantism in Germany, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. The conflict was intractable, ruinously expensive, and ultimately a failure. By end 1556, utterly worn out by a lifetime of constant warfare and travel, Charles did something unprecedented. He abdicated. He gave up. He divided his impossibly large empire, handing his Austrian lands and the title of Holy Roman Emperor to his brother Ferdinand, and the rest, Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and the American Empire, to his son, Philip II. Charles then retired to a monastery in Yuste, Spain, to spend the rest of his days in quiet contemplation and, reportedly, tinkering with a large collection of clocks. It was a fitting hobby for a man who had spent his life trying and failing to make the different parts of his empire run on the same schedule. Philip II was a very different man from his globe-trotting father. While Charles had been a cosmopolitan Fleming, fluent in multiple languages, Philip was thoroughly Spanish. He rarely left Spain, and he ruled his vast empire from a small, cell-like office in his newly built palace monastery, El Escorial, a massive, granite edifice outside Madrid that was part royal residence, part government complex, and part mausoleum. Philip was the ultimate bureaucrat king, a man who tried to run a global empire through paperwork. He was famously diligent, reading and annotating thousands of documents, and famously indecisive, often agonizing for weeks over minor decisions. His court was a place of somber, rigid etiquette, a reflection of the king's own austere and deeply pious personality. He was the micromanaging boss from hell, convinced that if he could just read one more report, he could solve any problem. Philip's reign was the zenith of Spanish power, the so-called Siglo de Oro, or Golden Century. The silver from the Americas continued to pour in, funding Spain's cultural and military might. This was the age of Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, the first modern novel. It was the age of the great painters El Greco, Velázquez, and Zurbarán. It was the age of the great playwrights Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca. Spanish armies were the most feared in Europe, and the Spanish navy dominated the seas. In 1571, a Spanish-led fleet won a stunning victory over the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto, a triumph that was celebrated all over Christian Europe. In 1580, Philip inherited the throne of Portugal, uniting the entire Iberian Peninsula and its two vast colonial empires under his rule. But beneath the golden veneer, the cracks were beginning to show. Philip, like his father, was embroiled in a series of ruinously expensive wars. His most intractable problem was the Netherlands. The Dutch provinces, which were Protestant and had a long tradition of self-government, rose up in revolt against Philip's attempts to impose religious orthodoxy and centralize control. The resulting conflict, the 80 Years' War, became a bloody, grinding quagmire, a Spanish ulcer that drained the Spanish treasury for decades. It was Spain's Vietnam, a war that could neither be won nor abandoned. Then there was England. The Protestant Queen Elizabeth I of England actively supported the Dutch rebels and encouraged English privateers, like Francis Drake, to raid Spanish shipping and colonies in the Americas. For Philip, this was an intolerable provocation. In 1588, he assembled the largest fleet Europe had ever seen, the Invincible Armada, to invade England and depose Elizabeth. The plan was complex, the logistics were a nightmare, and the weather in the English Channel was, as usual, terrible. The Armada was harassed by smaller, more maneuverable English ships and then scattered by a storm. The surviving ships were forced to make a long, disastrous journey home around the north of Scotland and Ireland, and less than half of the original fleet limped back to Spain. The defeat of the Armada was not a fatal blow, but it was a huge psychological shock, a sign that Spanish power was not invincible after all. Philip's reign ended in 1598, and he left a son, Philip III, an empire that was outwardly powerful but inwardly rotten. The state was bankrupt, having declared insolvency multiple times. The population was in decline, ravaged by plague and famine. The economy was stagnant, crippled by inflation and a tax system that crushed the productive classes while sparing the nobility. The 17th century, under the last three Spanish Habsburgs, Philip III, Philip IV, and the tragically inbred and infirm Charles II, was a century of slow, inexorable decline. These later Habsburgs were not the diligent workaholics their ancestors had been. They delegated the business of government to powerful chief ministers, known as validos. The most famous of these was the Count Duke of Olivares, who served Philip IV. Olivares was an intelligent and energetic minister who saw clearly that Spain was in deep trouble and desperately needed reform. He tried to create a more equitable tax system to promote economic development and, most ambitiously, to get the other parts of the Spanish monarchy, like Catalonia and Portugal, to share more of the financial and military burden of defending the empire, which fell disproportionately on Castile. His great project was the Union of Arms, a plan to create a central reserve army funded by all the king's dominions. It was a sensible idea, but it was met with fierce resistance. The other kingdoms, with their long-standing traditions of regional autonomy, saw it as an attack on their ancient liberties. In 1640, Spain's Annus Horribilis, both Catalonia and Portugal rose up in open revolt. The Catalan revolt was eventually suppressed after a long and bloody war, but Portugal, with French and English support, succeeded in regaining its independence. The empire was beginning to crumble. The 30 Years' War in Germany, another ruinous conflict, ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, which officially recognized the independence of the Netherlands and marked the end of Spain's military dominance in Europe. The torch of European leadership was passing to France. The final act of the Habsburg tragedy was the reign of Charles II, known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Due to generations of inbreeding, his parents were uncle and niece. Charles was a physical and mental wreck. He was chronically ill, unable to father an heir, and barely capable of ruling. His reign was a long, sad, and pathetic spectacle, a 35-year death watch. The great question that hung over every court in Europe was, who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire when Charles died? The other European powers, particularly France and Austria, circled like vultures, plotting to carve up the Spanish inheritance for themselves. When Charles finally died in 1700, his will named as his successor Philip of Anjou, the grandson of the powerful King Louis XIV of France. The prospect of a union between the two great powers of Spain and France, creating a Bourbon superstate that would dominate Europe, was intolerable to the other powers, particularly England, Austria, and the Netherlands. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive, global conflict that raged for 13 years. It was a war fought not just in Europe but also in North America and on the high seas. It was, in a sense, the First World War. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Philip of Anjou was recognized as King Philip V of Spain, but on the condition that the crowns of France and Spain would never be united. In exchange for this, Spain was forced to give up its remaining European possessions. Gibraltar and Minorca went to Britain, giving the Royal Navy a crucial foothold in the Mediterranean. The Spanish Netherlands, Naples, and Sardinia went to Austria. The great European empire of Charles V was gone. The Habsburg era was over. A new dynasty, the Bourbons, was on the throne. Spain, stripped of its European empire and exhausted by 2 centuries of imperial overstretch, could now, perhaps, turn its attention inward and begin the long, slow process of rebuilding. But as we shall see, the 18th century would bring its own set of challenges, its own brand of enlightenment, and its own peculiar brand of madness, right after this brief, soothing pause. Hashtag A Sleepy History of Spain. Part 6. Welcome back, my friends, to the gentle, rustling pages of Spanish history. We have bid a final, slightly wheezing farewell to the Habsburgs, a dynasty that burned so brightly and then guttered out in a sad spectacle of genetic decay. The throne of Spain now belongs to a new family, the Bourbons, imported from France. The 18th century has dawned, and with it a new spirit is sweeping across Europe, the Enlightenment. It was an age of reason, of science, of progress, an age that believed that human society, like a faulty clock, could be taken apart, understood, and put back together in a more rational and efficient way. And the new Bourbon kings of Spain, Philip V and his successors, were determined to apply this new, modernizing toolkit to their creaky, inefficient, and deeply traditional kingdom. Philip V, the first of the Spanish Bourbons, was a Frenchman, the grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the very embodiment of absolute monarchy. He and his advisors arrived in Spain with a clear mission: to remake the Spanish state in the image of the highly centralized, efficient French model. Their goal was to sweep away the chaotic, cobweb-ridden legacy of the Habsburgs and replace it with a streamlined, rational administration. This meant, above all, curtailing the power of the regional fueros, those ancient laws and privileges that gave regions like Aragon and Catalonia a significant degree of autonomy. The War of the Spanish Succession gave Philip the perfect opportunity. The regions of the Crown of Aragon had backed the losing Austrian candidate for the throne. As a punishment, and as part of his centralizing project, Philip issued the Nueva Planta decrees, which abolished the fueros of Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia, and subjected them to the laws and administration of Castile. The old, federated, composite monarchy of the Habsburgs was gone. Spain was now, for the first time, a truly unified, centralized state. It was a more efficient system, certainly, but it came at the cost of regional identities and created a legacy of resentment, particularly in Catalonia, that would simmer for centuries. The Bourbon reforms touched every aspect of Spanish life. They reorganized the government, creating a system of ministries or secretariats to handle specific areas like finance, war, and justice. They reformed the tax system, trying to make it more equitable and efficient. They sought to revive the moribund economy, promoting industry, agriculture, and trade. They built roads, canals, and shipyards. They were, in essence, trying to give Spain a long overdue tune-up, to drag it, kicking and screaming, into the 18th century. It was a massive project of top-down modernization, a kind of national renovation project directed by the king and his technocratic ministers. The greatest of these Bourbon reformers was Charles III, who reigned from 1759 to 1788. Charles had previously been the King of Naples, where he had already had a successful career as an enlightened monarch. He was a man of immense energy and a genuine desire to improve the lot of his people. He was the very model of an enlightened despot, a ruler who used his absolute power to enact rational, progressive reforms. His reign was the high-water mark of the Spanish Enlightenment. His ministers, men like Campomanes and Floridablanca, were tireless reformers who churned out a constant stream of legislation aimed at modernizing the country. They promoted education, science, and the arts. They tried to limit the vast, untaxed wealth of the church. They even tried to reform Spanish fashion, most famously with the Esquilake riots of 1766, when a royal decree banning the traditional long capes and wide-brimmed hats, which were said to conceal weapons and facilitate crime, sparked a massive popular uprising in Madrid. It was a stark reminder that even the most rational reforms could provoke a furious backlash if they were seen as an attack on traditional ways of life. But the Spanish Enlightenment was always a somewhat fragile and contradictory affair. It was an elite project, driven by a small circle of intellectuals and reform-minded ministers, and it never fully penetrated the deeply traditional and conservative society of the countryside. And it was always hampered by a fundamental tension. How do you promote the Enlightenment values of reason, criticism, and free inquiry in a country where the Catholic Church and the Inquisition still held immense power? The Spanish reformers had to tread a very fine line, promoting science and education while trying not to fall afoul of the religious authorities. It was like trying to host a science fair in a monastery library. The potential for conflict was ever present. Then, in 1788, Charles III died and was succeeded by his son, Charles IV. Charles IV was a well-meaning but weak and indecisive ruler, more interested in hunting than in the tedious business of government. And just a year into his reign, in 1789, an event occurred that would shatter the polite, ordered world of the Enlightenment and plunge Europe into a quarter-century of revolutionary turmoil. The French Revolution. The French Revolution sent a shockwave of terror through the royal courts of Europe. The Spanish government, under the direction of its chief minister, Manuel Godoy, a young and ambitious Guards officer who had risen to power through the favor of the Queen, reacted by trying to seal the borders and prevent the contagion of revolutionary ideas from spreading into Spain. The reformist, enlightened project of Charles III was abandoned, replaced by a reactionary policy of censorship and repression. But the revolutionary tide could not be held back. In 1793, after the execution of the French King Louis XVI, a cousin of Charles IV, Spain joined the coalition of European powers at war with revolutionary France. The war was a disaster for Spain. The French armies, fired by revolutionary zeal, proved more than a match for the old professional armies of Europe. They invaded Spain and forced the Spanish government to sue for peace. What followed was a period of bewildering diplomatic reversals. Spain, having been defeated by France, now allied itself with France against its former ally, Britain. This alliance had disastrous consequences for Spain. The powerful British Royal Navy swept the Spanish fleet from the seas, culminating in the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where a combined Franco-Spanish fleet was annihilated by Lord Nelson. The loss of its navy cut Spain off from its American empire, crippling its trade and its finances. The country was bankrupt, its government was discredited, and its military was in shambles, and then came Napoleon. By the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of France and, increasingly, of Europe. In 1807, he signed a treaty with the hapless Spanish government to allow French troops to cross Spain to invade Portugal, a British ally. But Napoleon had a hidden agenda. The French troops that entered Spain were not just passing through. They were an army of occupation. In 1808, in a series of cynical and brilliant maneuvers, Napoleon forced both Charles IV and his son, Ferdinand VII, to abdicate, and then he placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. Napoleon thought he had conquered Spain with the stroke of a pen. He was about to learn, as the Romans had learned 2,000 years before him, that Spain is not so easily subdued. On May 2, 1808, the people of Madrid rose up in a spontaneous, desperate rebellion against the French occupying troops. The uprising was brutally crushed, but it was the spark that ignited a nationwide insurrection. All across Spain, local juntas, or committees, were formed to lead the resistance against the French invaders. What followed was the Peninsular War, or, as the Spanish call it, the War of Independence. It was a new kind of war, a total war that involved not just armies, but the entire population. It was a war of incredible brutality and savagery on both sides, a war that gave the world a new word, guerrilla, or little war. Spanish guerrilla fighters, operating in small, irregular bands, harassed French supply lines, ambushed patrols, and tied down hundreds of thousands of French troops in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign. It was, as Napoleon himself would later call it, the Spanish ulcer that bled his empire dry. The war was also a political revolution. In the absence of their king, the Spanish patriots had to invent a new form of government. In 1810, a national Cortes, or parliament, convened in the besieged city of Cadiz. This Cortes was dominated by liberals, men who had been inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, even as they fought against French armies, and who wanted to create a modern, constitutional monarchy for Spain. In 1812, they produced a remarkable document, the Constitution of 1812. It was one of the most liberal and progressive constitutions of its time. It declared that sovereignty resided in the nation, not the king. It established a constitutional monarchy with a limited monarch and a powerful, elected parliament. It abolished feudalism, the Inquisition, and the privileges of the nobility. It was a blueprint for a new, liberal Spain. With the help of a British army led by the Duke of Wellington, the Spanish forces eventually drove the French out of the peninsula. In 1814, the beloved King Ferdinand VII, who had spent the war as a pampered prisoner in France, returned to Spain. The liberals who had fought and died in his name expected him to embrace the new constitution. They were to be bitterly disappointed. Ferdinand VII, known as El Deseado, the Desired, turned out to be one of the worst kings in Spanish history. He was a cruel, vindictive, and absolutist monarch who had no intention of sharing power. Upon his return, he promptly abolished the Constitution of 1812, arrested the leading liberals, and restored the absolute monarchy as if the previous 6 years had never happened. The return of Ferdinand VII marked the beginning of a century-long struggle in Spain between the forces of liberalism and the forces of absolutism and reaction. It was a struggle that would tear the country apart, leading to a series of civil wars, military coups, and political crises. The 19th century in Spain was a dizzying, chaotic period of instability, a political soap opera of epic proportions. And as if that weren't enough, the turmoil in Spain had a devastating consequence on the other side of the Atlantic. The power vacuum created by the French invasion and the subsequent political chaos had given the Spanish colonies in the Americas the opportunity to fight for their own independence. By 1825, after a series of long and bloody wars of liberation, all of Spain's vast mainland American empire was gone. Only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines remained. The great global empire that had been the source of Spain's power and wealth for 3 centuries had vanished. Spain was now a second-rate power, a country haunted by its glorious past and struggling to find its place in the modern world. The 19th century would be a long, painful, and often bloody search for a new identity. But that, my sleepy companions, is a story for another time. After this brief and much-needed pause, hashtag A Sleepy History of Spain, Part 7. Welcome back, my weary travelers through time. We return to a Spain that is, to put it mildly, having a very bad century. The 19th century. The glorious, globe-spanning empire is gone, lost in a series of revolutionary wars that Spain was too distracted and dysfunctional to win. The beloved King Ferdinand VII, having been restored to his throne, has revealed himself to be a reactionary tyrant, crushing the liberal dreams that had been forged in the fires of the war against Napoleon. Spain is now a country adrift, a former superpower suffering from a severe case of post-imperial depression and locked in a bitter, seemingly endless struggle with itself. The entire 19th century in Spain can be understood as a brutal tug-of-war between 2 opposing Spains. On one side was liberal Spain, a collection of urban intellectuals, army officers, and middle-class professionals who dreamed of a modern, constitutional, and secular nation, a Spain that looked like the more advanced countries of Northern Europe, like Britain or France. On the other side was traditional Spain, a powerful coalition of the monarchy, the Catholic Church, and the deeply conservative rural peasantry who clung fiercely to the old ways, to the values of absolutism, religious orthodoxy, and a hierarchical society. This was not a polite political debate. It was a violent, irreconcilable conflict that would repeatedly plunge the country into civil war. The first half of Ferdinand VI's reign was a period of brutal repression, the so-called ominous decade. But the liberals didn't just give up. They went underground, formed secret societies, and plotted. In 1820, a group of army officers who were about to be sent to America to fight the colonial independence movements launched a military coup, a pronunciamiento, and forced Ferdinand to restore the liberal constitution of 1812. This began the Trienio Liberal, a 3-year period of liberal rule. But the liberals were divided, and the king was a hostile captive. In 1823, a French army, with the blessing of the other conservative powers of Europe, invaded Spain and restored Ferdinand to his absolute power. The cycle of revolution and reaction continued. The real trouble, however, began with Ferdinand's death in 1833. Ferdinand had no sons, only a daughter, Isabella. Now, Spain had a tradition, the Salic law, which had been imported by the Bourbon dynasty, that prevented women from inheriting the throne. But Ferdinand, wanting his daughter to succeed him, had issued a pragmatic sanction to set aside the Salic law. This enraged his younger brother, Don Carlos, who considered himself the rightful heir. Upon Ferdinand's death, the country split. The liberals, in a pragmatic move, rallied to the cause of the infant Queen Isabella II, seeing a regency as their best chance to regain power. The conservatives, the absolutists, the defenders of the old order, rallied to the cause of Don Carlos. The result was the First Carlist War. The Carlist Wars were a series of brutal civil wars that would plague Spain for much of the 19th century. They were more than just a dynastic dispute. They were a clash of civilizations, a battle for the soul of Spain. The Carlists, whose slogan was God, Country, and King, were champions of a reactionary, anti-liberal, and ultra-Catholic vision of Spain. Their power base was in the deeply conservative rural regions of the Basque Country and Navarre. The liberals, or Cristinos as they were known, controlled the cities and the machinery of the state. The First Carlist War was a savage, 7-year conflict that ended in a victory for the liberals, but it did not destroy Carlism. The movement would go underground, only to re-emerge later in the century to plunge the country back into war. The reign of Isabella II, which lasted from 1833 to 1868, was a chaotic and sordid affair. It was a period of endemic political instability, dominated by a series of military strongmen, or espadons, who would seize power through pronunciamientos, write a new constitution to suit their political faction, there were several, and then be overthrown by the next general in line. It was a political system based on the military coup. The Queen herself was a frivolous and politically inept ruler whose scandalous private life further discredited the monarchy. The economy stagnated, the country remained poor and largely illiterate, and the political system was a corrupt farce, a game played by a tiny elite of generals and politicians in Madrid. By 1868, the country had had enough. A coalition of progressive generals and politicians led a successful revolution, the Glorious Revolution, that drove Queen Isabella into exile. And now Spain had a new problem. It had gotten rid of its monarch, but what was it going to replace her with? The revolutionaries were monarchists, but they needed a new king. So they went on a bizarre, 2-year-long search for a suitable candidate, a kind of royal talent show. They offered the throne to various European princes, most of whom were smart enough to turn it down. Eventually, they found an Italian prince, Amadeo of Savoy, who reluctantly agreed to take the job. King Amadeo I was a well-meaning liberal monarch, but he was a foreigner in a country that was ungovernable. He faced opposition from all sides, from the Carlists, from the supporters of the exiled Isabella, and now from a new and growing force, the Republicans. After 2 years of chaos, Amadeo, in a moment of profound exasperation, abdicated, declaring that the Spanish were ungovernable. He had had enough. In 1873, Spain tried a new experiment, the First Spanish Republic. It was a noble idea, but it was doomed from the start. The Republicans were hopelessly divided between those who wanted a centralized republic and those who wanted a federal republic, a collection of self-governing regions. The country descended into chaos. The Third Carlist War erupted in the north, and a new, even more radical movement, the Cantonalist Revolt, broke out in the south, where cities declared themselves independent cantons or city-states. It was anarchy. Within a year, the republic had collapsed. In 1874, the army, in yet another pronunciamiento, stepped in and restored the monarchy, this time in the person of Isabella's son, Alfonso XII. This period, known as the Restoration, brought a measure of much-needed stability to Spain. The new political system, designed by the conservative politician Cánovas del Castillo, was a masterpiece of cynical pragmatism. It was a constitutional monarchy, but it was based on a system called the Turno Pacifico, the peaceful turn. The two main political parties, the conservatives and the liberals, who were not all that different from each other, agreed to take turns in power. Elections were held, but they were a complete sham. Their results carefully managed from the center to ensure that the designated party would win. It was a stable system, but it was profoundly undemocratic, a system that excluded the vast majority of the population from any real political participation. It was a system designed to keep the lid on the boiling pot of Spanish society, and while Spain was tearing itself apart, the last remnants of its once great empire were slipping away. In Cuba and the Philippines, nationalist independence movements were gaining strength. In 1895, a full-scale war for independence broke out in Cuba. The Spanish response was brutal, and the war was a bloody stalemate. Then, in 1898, a new player entered the game, the United States. The American press, in a frenzy of yellow journalism, whipped up public support for the Cuban rebels. The mysterious explosion of the American battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor was the final pretext. The United States declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War was a short and humiliating disaster for Spain. The decrepit Spanish Navy was no match for the modern American fleet. In a few months, it was all over. Spain was defeated, and it was forced to cede its last significant colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, to the United States. The disaster of '98, as it became known, was a profound national trauma for Spain. It was the final, undeniable proof that the glorious imperial past was gone forever. It sparked a period of intense national soul-searching, a movement of intellectuals and writers known as the Generation of '98, who grappled with the painful question of what had gone wrong with Spain and what its future could be. The early 20th century saw the slow decay of the Restoration system. The old political parties were losing their grip. New social and political forces were emerging, a growing industrial working class, drawn to the radical ideologies of socialism and anarchism, powerful regionalist movements, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country, demanding autonomy, and an increasingly politicized army that saw itself as the ultimate arbiter of the nation's destiny. The country was becoming more polarized, more unstable. The brief period of calm was over in 1923, with the political system paralyzed and the country embroiled in an unpopular colonial war in Morocco. Another general, Miguel Primo de Rivera, staged a coup and established a military dictatorship. He suspended the constitution, dissolved the political parties, and ruled as a paternalistic dictator, a kind of Spanish Mussolini, though without the ideological fanaticism. For a few years, his regime brought a degree of order and economic progress. But the dictatorship became increasingly unpopular, and in 1930, having lost the support of the army and the king, Primo de Rivera resigned and went into exile. The fall of the dictator discredited the monarchy that had supported him. In the municipal elections of April 1931, Republican parties won a landslide victory in all the major cities. The result was taken as a plebiscite on the monarchy itself. King Alfonso XIII, seeing that he had lost the support of his people, chose to leave the country rather than risk a civil war. On April 14, 1931, the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. It was a moment of immense hope and optimism, a chance to finally create the modern, democratic Spain that the liberals of the 19th century had dreamed of. But the Republic was born into a world that was lurching toward extremism, a Europe polarized by the Great Depression and the rise of fascism and communism. And it had inherited all of Spain's old, intractable problems, The conflict between church and state, the struggle between the center and the regions, the deep social divisions between rich and poor. The Second Republic would be a brief, brilliant, and ultimately tragic experiment, a final, desperate attempt to solve the Spanish problem by peaceful, democratic means. An attempt that would end, just 5 years later, in the horror of the Spanish Civil War. But that, my friends, is a darkness we will face together after this one last, peaceful pause. And so, my dear listeners, we drift back for our final session in the tumultuous, troubled, and endlessly fascinating history of Spain. We have arrived at a moment of fragile, beautiful hope, the birth of the Second Spanish Republic in 1931. The king has packed his bags, the monarchy is gone, and for the first time, Spain is a truly democratic republic. A coalition of moderate Republicans and socialists took power, determined to build a new Spain. They drafted a new, progressive constitution that guaranteed freedom of speech and religion, gave women the right to vote, and separated church and state. They embarked on an ambitious program of reforms aimed at tackling the country's deep-seated problems. They started a program of land reform to address the vast inequalities in the countryside. They granted a statute of autonomy to Catalonia. They invested in public education, building thousands of new schools to combat the country's chronic illiteracy. It was a genuine, heartfelt attempt to create a more just and modern society, but the Republic was beset by enemies from the very beginning. The forces of the old, traditional Spain, the landowning elite, the Catholic Church, and much of the army officer corps, viewed the Republic and its secularizing, reformist agenda with horror. They saw it as an attack on the very soul of Catholic Spain. On the other side, the Republic was attacked from the left. The powerful anarchist movement, which was particularly strong in Catalonia and Andalusia, rejected the very idea of a state, even a democratic one, and called for a social revolution. They organized strikes, burned churches, and fomented unrest. The Republic was caught in the middle, squeezed between a right wing that thought it was going too far, too fast, and a left wing that thought it wasn't going nearly far enough. The political climate became increasingly polarized, increasingly violent. The center could not hold. In 1933, a right-wing coalition won the elections and set about rolling back the reforms of the previous 2 years. This led to a radicalization of the left, culminating in a major miners' uprising in Asturias in 1934, which was brutally crushed by the army. The general in charge of the repression was a man named Francisco Franco. The country was spiraling into a cycle of tit-for-tat violence. In the elections of February 1936, a left-wing coalition, the Popular Front, narrowly won victory. The political atmosphere was now at a fever pitch. The right, convinced that a communist revolution was imminent, decided that the time had come to act. For months, a group of right-wing generals had been plotting a military coup. On July 17, 1936, the coup began. Army garrisons in Spanish Morocco, led by General Franco, rose up against the Republic. The plotters expected to take control of the country in a swift, decisive action. But they had miscalculated. The coup succeeded in some parts of the country, the conservative heartlands of Old Castile and Navarre, but it failed in the major cities, like Madrid and Barcelona, and in the industrial regions, where the trade unions and loyal security forces managed to defeat the rebels. The result was not a quick coup, but the division of Spain into two warring camps. The Spanish Civil War had begun. It was a war of appalling brutality, a war that was, in many ways, a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. It quickly became an international conflict. The Republican government appealed to the democratic powers of Britain and France for help, but they, fearful of sparking a wider European war, adopted a policy of non-intervention, which in practice meant a blockade that primarily hurt the Republic. The nationalists, as the rebels were known, had no such problems. They received massive and decisive military aid from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Hitler and Mussolini saw the Spanish conflict as a perfect opportunity to test their new weapons and tactics and to gain a new fascist ally in Western Europe. The Republic, in its desperation, turned to the only major power willing to help, the Soviet Union. Stalin provided aid, but at a high price. The growing influence of the Spanish Communist Party within the Republican government. For 3 years, Spain tore itself apart. It was a war of ideologies, a war of classes, a war of regions, a war of religion. It was a war of heroic resistance and unspeakable atrocities on both sides. The nationalists, under the increasingly centralized command of General Franco, slowly, methodically, and brutally ground down the forces of the Republic. In the spring of 1939, after the fall of Barcelona and Madrid, the war was finally over. Franco was victorious. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Hundreds of thousands more had fled into exile. The Republic was destroyed. What followed was not a peace, but a cold, silent, and vengeful occupation of Spain by the victors. Franco established a totalitarian dictatorship that would last for nearly 40 years. All political parties were banned, except for Franco's own movement, the Falange. The press was censored. The unions were suppressed. The autonomy of the regions was abolished. The Catholic Church was restored to its position of power and privilege. The regime executed tens of thousands of its former political opponents and imprisoned hundreds of thousands more in concentration camps and forced labor battalions. It was a long, gray, and suffocating period of repression, a time the Spanish call the post-war. Franco's regime survived the Second World War by skillfully maintaining a policy of neutrality, despite its ideological sympathies with the Axis powers. In the post-war years, it was initially ostracized as a pariah state, the last surviving fascist dictatorship in Europe. But as the Cold War set in, Franco's staunch anti-communism made him a useful, if unsavory, ally for the United States. In the 1950s, Spain was gradually readmitted into the international community. In the 1960s, the regime, under the guidance of a new generation of technocrats linked to the Catholic lay organization Opus Dei, embarked on a policy of economic liberalization. The result was the Spanish miracle, a period of rapid economic growth and industrialization that transformed Spain from a poor, agrarian country into a modern, industrial nation. A new, urban middle class emerged, and millions of tourists began to flock to Spain's sunny beaches. But economic modernization was not accompanied by political liberalization. The regime remained a rigid, authoritarian dictatorship. Franco, now aging, began to plan for the future. In 1969, he designated as his successor Prince Juan Carlos, the grandson of the last king of Spain, Alfonso XIII. Franco intended for Juan Carlos to continue his authoritarian regime, to be a king in the mold of the caudillo. It was to be the dictator's final and greatest miscalculation. Franco finally died in his bed in November 1975. 2 days later, Juan Carlos was proclaimed king. And then, to the astonishment of the world and the dismay of the old Francoist hardliners, the king began to carefully, skillfully, and courageously dismantle the dictatorship that had been entrusted to him. He appointed a reformist prime minister, Adolfo Suarez, and together, they steered the country toward democracy. It was a masterful and delicate process, the transition. They legalized the political parties, including, most controversially, the Communist Party. They passed a law for political reform. And in June 1977, Spain held its first free elections in over 40 years. In 1978, a new, democratic constitution was drafted, and approved by a referendum. It established a constitutional monarchy, guaranteed fundamental rights and freedoms, and created a system of autonomous regions, finally providing a democratic solution to Spain's age-old regional problem. The transition was not without its challenges. It was threatened by terrorism from the Basque separatist group ETA and by the rumblings of discontent from the old Francoist military establishment. The ultimate test came on February 23, 1981, when a group of Civil Guard officers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Teguero, stormed the Spanish parliament and took the government hostage in an attempted coup. The future of Spanish democracy hung in the balance. But King Juan Carlos, in the defining moment of his reign, went on television in the middle of the night, dressed in his uniform as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and decisively condemned the coup, ordering the army to remain loyal to the democratic government. The coup collapsed. Spanish democracy had survived its greatest trial. Since then, Spain has been a stable, modern, and successful European democracy. It joined the European Economic Community, now the European Union, in 1986, a symbolic moment that marked its definitive return to the European mainstream. It has seen peaceful transfers of power between the main center-right and center-left political parties. It has become a vibrant, open, and tolerant society, a country that has, in a remarkably short period of time, managed to come to terms with its traumatic past and build a peaceful and prosperous future. The old ghosts have not been entirely exorcised. The legacy of the Civil War still casts a long shadow. The question of regional identity, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country, remains a potent and sometimes divisive issue. But the story of modern Spain is, above all, a story of a remarkable and successful transition from dictatorship to democracy, a testament to the wisdom, the moderation, and the resilience of the Spanish people. And so, my dear slumberers, our long journey through the centuries comes to an end. We have seen Spain in all its glory and all its misery. We have seen it as a Roman province, a Visigothic kingdom, a brilliant Islamic caliphate, a global empire, and a modern democracy. It is a history of endless reinvention, of tragic failures and astonishing successes. It is the story of a country that has been, at various times, the center of the world and a forgotten backwater, a beacon of civilization and a cauldron of conflict. It is a complex, contradictory, and deeply human story. And now, as the final echoes of the past fade away, let us leave this land to its dreams, and let us, too, drift into the quiet, peaceful embrace of sleep. Good night. The Spanish experience with empire is particularly instructive when we consider the broader patterns of European imperialism. Unlike the British, who built their empire gradually over centuries through a combination of trade, settlement, and conquest, the Spanish acquired their vast American territories in a sudden, almost accidental burst of activity. Within a few decades of Columbus's first voyage, Spain found itself in possession of territories that stretched from California to Patagonia, from the Caribbean to the Philippines. It was an empire acquired not through careful planning but through the reckless audacity of a few hundred conquistadors and the catastrophic vulnerability of the native populations to European diseases. The administrative challenge of governing such a vast and distant empire was staggering. The Spanish crown attempted to rule its American possessions through a complex bureaucracy centered in Seville and Madrid. The Council of the Indies, established in 1524, was responsible for all legislation and administration relating to the Americas. Every significant decision, from the appointment of a minor official to the authorization of a new expedition, had to be approved in Spain. Documents had to travel thousands of miles across the Atlantic, a journey that could take months. By the time a response arrived, the situation on the ground had often changed completely. It was a system that elevated paperwork to an art form and made timely decision-making virtually impossible. The Spanish colonial system was also characterized by a fundamental contradiction. On the one hand, the crown was genuinely concerned with the welfare of the native population and the spread of Christianity. The famous debates at Valladolid in 1550 to 1551, where the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas argued passionately for the rights and humanity of the indigenous peoples, showed that there was a real moral debate within Spanish society about the treatment of the Native Americans. The Crown issued numerous laws and ordinances designed to protect the Indians from exploitation. On the other hand, the entire colonial economy was based on the exploitation of native labor, whether through the encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers the right to demand tribute and labor from the Indians, or through the mita, a system of forced labor in the silver mines. The gap between the high-minded rhetoric of the crown and the brutal reality on the ground was vast. The silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia became a symbol of both the wealth and the horror of the Spanish colonial system. Discovered in 1545, Potosi quickly became one of the largest and richest cities in the world, a boomtown built on silver. At its peak in the early 17th century, it had a population of over 160,000, larger than London or Paris at the time. But the wealth of Potosi was extracted at a terrible human cost. Tens of thousands of indigenous workers, conscripted through the mita system, labored in appalling conditions in the mines, many of them dying from accidents, exhaustion, or mercury poisoning. The mountain of Potosi, it was said, was made of silver, but it was also a mountain of bones. The cultural legacy of Spain's imperial age is complex and contested. On the one hand, the Spanish brought with them their language, their religion, their legal system, and their architecture, creating a new, hybrid culture that blended European and indigenous elements. The great colonial cities of Mexico City, Lima, and Quito are filled with magnificent Baroque churches and palaces that testify to the wealth and ambition of the colonial elite. Spanish became the dominant language of Latin America, and Catholicism became the dominant religion. On the other hand, the conquest resulted in the destruction of the great indigenous civilizations of the Aztecs and the Incas, the loss of countless lives, and the imposition of a colonial system that was often brutal and exploitative. The debate over the legacy of the Spanish conquest continues to this day, particularly in Latin America, where the question of how to remember and commemorate this period remains deeply divisive. Back in Spain itself, the wealth from the Americas had a paradoxical effect. In the short term, it made Spain the richest and most powerful country in Europe. But in the long term, it contributed to economic stagnation and decline. The influx of silver caused severe inflation, making Spanish goods more expensive and less competitive. It discouraged investment in agriculture and industry. Why bother making things when you could just buy them with American silver? The Spanish economy became dangerously dependent on this single source of income, and when the flow of silver began to decline in the 17th century, the economy went into a tailspin. The Spanish crown, despite its vast revenues, was perpetually in debt, having borrowed heavily to finance its wars in Europe. It declared bankruptcy multiple times, defaulting on its loans to the great banking houses of Europe. It was a classic case of the resource curse, where an abundance of natural resources leads not to prosperity, but to economic dysfunction. The decline of Spain in the 17th century was not just economic, but also cultural and psychological. The confident, expansive Spain of the 16th century, the Spain of conquistadors and explorers, gave way to a more introspective, pessimistic Spain. The literature of the period, particularly the works of Cervantes and the playwrights of the Golden Age, is filled with a sense of disillusionment and melancholy. Don Quixote, the deluded knight who tilts at windmills, became a symbol of Spain itself, a country living in the past, clinging to outdated ideals, and unable to adapt to a changing world. The Spanish concept of desengano, or disillusionment, became a central theme in the culture of the period. It was a recognition that the Golden Age was over, that the dreams of empire had turned to dust. The 18th century Bourbon reforms were an attempt to reverse this decline, to modernize Spain and make it competitive with the other great powers of Europe. The reformers looked to France as a model, with its centralized administration, its efficient tax system, and its promotion of industry and commerce. They were inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, progress, and the perfectibility of human society. But the reforms faced enormous obstacles. Spanish society was deeply conservative, and the power of the church and the nobility was entrenched. The reformers were often seen as foreign interlopers, trying to impose alien ideas on a proud and traditional nation. The resistance to reform was not just political, but also cultural. Many Spaniards saw the Enlightenment as a threat to their Catholic faith and their traditional way of life. The Napoleonic invasion and the subsequent War of Independence were a watershed moment in Spanish history. The war was not just a struggle against a foreign invader, but also a civil war, a conflict between those who supported the old order and those who wanted to create a new, liberal Spain. The liberals who drafted the Constitution of 1812 were inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, but they were also deeply patriotic Spaniards who saw themselves as defending their nation against French tyranny. The Constitution they created was a remarkable document, one of the most progressive of its time. But it was also a document that was deeply controversial, and it would become a symbol of the bitter political divisions that would plague Spain for the next century and a half. The 19th century in Spain is often seen as a period of failure, a century of missed opportunities and squandered potential. While other European countries were industrializing, building railways, and creating modern economies, Spain remained largely agrarian and backward. While other countries were developing stable democratic institutions, Spain was plagued by military coups, civil wars, and political instability. The question of why Spain failed to modernize in the 19th century has been the subject of endless debate among historians. Some blame the legacy of empire, the resource curse of American silver. Others point to the power of the church and the conservative elite, who resisted change. Still others emphasize the weakness of the Spanish bourgeoisie, the lack of a strong middle class that could drive economic and political modernization. The answer is probably a combination of all these factors, plus a healthy dose of bad luck and poor timing, but it would be wrong to see the 19th century as entirely negative. Despite the political chaos, there were important developments. The population grew, cities expanded, and there were the beginnings of industrialization, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country. A new generation of intellectuals and writers emerged, grappling with the question of Spanish identity and Spain's place in the modern world. The generation of '98, which included writers like Miguel de Unamuno and Pío Baroja, engaged in a profound and often anguished examination of Spanish history and culture. They asked difficult questions. What had gone wrong with Spain? Why had it fallen so far behind the rest of Europe? What did it mean to be Spanish in the modern world? These were not just academic questions, they were existential questions that went to the heart of Spanish identity. And now, my dear friends, as we approach the end of our long, meandering journey through the corridors of Spanish time, let us pause for a moment to reflect on what we have witnessed. We have seen a land that has been, at various times, the cradle of prehistoric art, the western frontier of the Roman Empire, the jewel of the Islamic world, the greatest power on earth, and a country torn apart by its own internal contradictions. We have watched as empires rose and fell, as religions clashed and coexisted, as kings and queens made decisions both brilliant and catastrophic. We have seen Spain at its most glorious and at its most tragic. The story of Spain is, in many ways, the story of Europe in miniature. It is a story of conquest and reconquest, of cultural fusion and violent rejection, of enlightenment and reaction, of revolution and restoration. It is a story that refuses to follow a simple narrative arc. Just when you think you understand where Spain is heading, it takes a sharp, unexpected turn. It is a history that is messy, contradictory, and deeply human. One of the most striking features of Spanish history is its cyclical nature, the way certain themes and conflicts seem to repeat themselves across the centuries. The tension between centralization and regional autonomy, for instance, is a thread that runs from the Visigothic period through the medieval kingdoms, the Habsburg and Bourbon monarchies, the 19th century civil wars, the Second Republic, the Franco dictatorship, and right up to the present day. The question of what it means to be Spanish, and whether there is even such a thing as a single, unified Spanish identity, has never been fully resolved. It is a question that continues to generate passionate debate and, sometimes, bitter conflict. Another recurring theme is the role of religion. From the Christianization of the Roman Empire, through the centuries of Muslim rule and the Reconquista, the establishment of the Inquisition, the anti-clerical violence of the 19th and 20th centuries, to the role of the Catholic Church in supporting the Franco regime, religion has been a central and often divisive force in Spanish history. Spain has been, at different times, a champion of Catholic orthodoxy and a battleground for secular ideals. The relationship between church and state, between faith and reason, has been a constant source of tension and conflict. And then there is the question of Spain's place in the world. For a brief, dazzling period in the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain was the dominant global power, the center of a vast empire upon which, it was said, the sun never set. But that empire was built on shaky foundations, and its collapse was as dramatic as its rise. The loss of the American colonies in the early 19th century and the final humiliation of 1898 forced Spain to confront a painful reality. It was no longer a great power. The 20th century was, in many ways, a struggle to come to terms with this loss, to find a new identity and a new role in a world that had moved on. But perhaps the most important lesson of Spanish history is the resilience of the Spanish people. Despite centuries of war, dictatorship, economic hardship, and political turmoil, Spain has not only survived but has managed, in the last few decades, to build a stable, prosperous, and democratic society. The transition from dictatorship to democracy after Franco's death is one of the great success stories of the late 20th century. It was a transition that could have easily descended into violence and chaos, but instead, it was managed with remarkable wisdom, restraint, and a willingness to compromise. It was a triumph of pragmatism over ideology, of dialogue over confrontation. Today, Spain is a modern European democracy, a member of the European Union and NATO, a country that has embraced globalization and modernity while still maintaining its rich cultural heritage. It is a country of vibrant cities and beautiful landscapes, of world-class art and literature, of passionate debates and lively festivals. It is a country that has learned, through painful experience, the value of tolerance, pluralism, and democratic institutions. It is not a perfect country. No country is. But it is a country that has come a long way from the dark days of the Civil War and the Franco dictatorship, and yet the ghosts of the past are never far away. The question of Catalonia's relationship with the rest of Spain remains unresolved and continues to generate tension. The legacy of the Civil War, the question of historical memory, and how to deal with the crimes of the Franco regime are still subjects of intense debate. The economic crisis of recent years has exposed deep social and economic inequalities. Spain, like all countries, continues to grapple with the challenges of the present while carrying the weight of its complex and often painful past. As we drift toward the end of our journey, it is worth remembering that history is not just a collection of dates and events, of kings and battles. It is the story of real people, of their hopes and fears, their triumphs and tragedies. It is the story of how societies are built, how they change, and how they endure. The history of Spain is a reminder that progress is never linear, that setbacks are inevitable, and that the struggle for a better future is a constant, ongoing process. So, as we close the book on this long, sleepy history of Spain, let us remember the lessons it teaches us. Let us remember the importance of tolerance and understanding, the dangers of fanaticism and intolerance, the value of democracy, and the rule of law. Let us remember that history is not just about the past, it is also about the present and the future. It is a guide, a warning, and an inspiration. And let us remember, above all, that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, always the possibility of renewal and redemption. And now, my dear slumberers, as the final echoes of the past fade into the gentle silence of the night, I bid you a fond farewell. May your dreams be filled with the warm sun of Andalusia, the cool mountains of the Pyrenees, and the endless, rolling plains of Castile. May you sleep soundly, knowing that history, for all its turmoil and tragedy, is also a story of human resilience, creativity, and hope. Good night, and may the gentle currents of time carry you safely through the night. Until we meet again, in another time, in another place, in another history. Sleep well, my friends. Sleep well.